Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you're all doing well. If you're new here, I live full-time in that 4Runner up there, traveling around, taking landscape photos and making videos like this one. Now, you might be wondering why I'm wearing this getup to do a editing video. And it's because making editing videos out on the road without a desk or proper lighting or anything like that is very difficult. So I wanted to try something new. I'm going to actually try to explain this whole editing process out in the field while I'm prepping for sunset. Not sure if it's going to work, so bear with me and I hope that it does. In this particular video, we're going to be talking about how to edit around some of your limitations in some of your photos. We can't always take perfect images, whether it's underexposure or overexposure, or we lack data in the image, or we just don't have the light that we want in an image. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today, using a very specific example that I took a few weeks ago. So with that said, let's just jump in and take a look at the image. All right, so in last week's video, I had a very tough time taking this image, and it resulted in why I'm making this video. When taking that image, which by the way, if you missed it, you can check out here, I didn't film a whole lot because I couldn't. The wind was so bad, it was slippery. I didn't know if I was gonna fall over the ledge, drop my camera or anything, and the light was happening so quickly as I found my shot that I really had no time to set up. And even if I wanted to set up, my camera was basically this close to the ground, which meant that I couldn't set up a tripod, and even if I wanted to set up a tripod, I probably wouldn't have been able to manipulate it enough on that slippery rock and gotten away with it. So what I had to do is just get an image in the camera. And I think this is an important thing to remember, is that especially in landscape photography, we don't always have time to set up a tripod or get bracketed exposure or wait for the perfect moment. The light was happening in an instant. Actually, right after I was finished taking these photos, the sun went behind some clouds, and I would have missed it if I had tried to set anything up. But the result is I have an image that has a loss of data. I wasn't able to capture the entire dynamic range of the image in one photo. I needed to be able to expose for all those dark areas in the rocks and stuff so that I could bring out that detail, but that meant overblowing and blowing out my entire sky. Now, that's what this entire video is about, is using that limitation, using that imperfect image and manipulating our edit around that imperfection. So without further ado, let's just jump into Lightroom for real and take a look at it and what we're gonna do to fix it. All right, so something I do on almost every edit is I just see what data I have and make sure that I have everything I could possibly need. To do that, I bring up my exposure by about 3 stops and I look at the shadows to get an idea of how clean those shadows are. And then what I'm gonna do is bring that exposure down by 3 stops and see what my highlights look like. Now in this particular case, when I bring it down by 3, in my exposure, you're going to see that entire area of the sky is blown out just like I described. And that's kind of the limitation we have for this particular image. So we're going to build around that, but we're going to start by doing my basic edit, which is switching my color profile to Adobe Landscape, setting my white balance, but not necessarily locking that in. I might manipulate it a little bit more later. Scrolling down to calibration, changing that. I think it's something like +55 and -8 on the tone under my blue calibration setting. And then other than that, that's pretty much our basic edit. Now what I'm gonna wanna do is build around that blown out sky. So you can tell that there's a lot of stuff going on in this image that actually really works. It looks pretty good, but if we try to bring down the highlights of the sky or bring down the exposure, you're just gonna see that blown out part of the sky and it's gonna look really bad. So what we can do is just build our entire edit around that sky and that overexposure. To do that, the first thing we're going to do is create a graduated filter that's going to affect the entire sky. Now, all I'm doing with this particular one is increasing my dehaze by about 30-ish, and what that's going to do is just add some micro contrast, add some color into the sky that I tend to like, and in this particular case, it adds a nice color gradient from the brightest parts to the darkest parts. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to bring down the highlights of the sky, but if I do it too much using that same graduated filter, what's going to happen is it's going to cause you to see where that data loss is, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Basically, we want the sky to look like we purposely blew it out and that it just gets slightly darker as it gets to the edges of the sky, rather than having that really rough line or fall off immediately. So to do that, I'm going to create a radial filter around that particular part of the sky, that blown out part. I'm going to invert it so that it's only affecting the other parts of the sky rather than the blown out part, and then I'm going to bring down my highlights. And what that's going to do is bring down the highlights around that blown out part of the image, but it's not going to bring down the highlights in the areas we want to leave bright to have that natural graduation. Now what you're going to notice is it's going to affect my entire image. So it's bringing down the highlights in all those waves and on the rocks in the image, and we don't want that. To fix that, we're actually just going to subtract a graduated filter from our radial filter. So all we're going to do is click on subtract, select a graduated filter, and then we're going to drag it from bottom up and basically remove that mask for that part of the image. If I highlight over that graduated filter, you can tell it's affecting the entire foreground of the image. If I highlight over the radial mask, it's affecting the entire sky and the entire image. But if I highlight over the entire mask, so it's subtracting that graduated filter from our radial filter, all it's doing is affecting the sky, which is exactly what we want. Now the last thing I want to do is bring up the whites of my waves and bring up the foreground exposure by a little bit. To do that, all I'm going to do is create a new graduated filter mask, and then I'm just going to increase my whites. And all of this is going to manipulate based off of your image, but I think for mine, it was something like +30 in the whites and maybe a tiny bit of exposure or shadows under that graduated filter. Pardon the interruption, as you can tell, shooting sunset again, and I just wanted to give a little reminder that if you wanted to support me in more ways than just liking or subscribing to my channel, there's links down below to check out some of my print sales, but also, and more exciting, I finally have my workshop listed on my website for the fall color change in Colorado in 2022. I'm really excited. It's something that I've been working towards for years, and it's really a big moment for me. So I hope that you would just check it out, click on it. All of the details for the workshop are down below in that link. And honestly, if you just have any feedback or anything like that, you can email me or questions about the workshop, and I'd love to hear it. Anyways, let's get back to the editing video. All right, so now that we've started our edit and built it around that particular limitation in our photo of that blown out sky, all I do is just go back and finish my edit in Lightroom using the Basics tab and a few other things. I think I bring my whites of the whole image up by about 15. That's just gonna brighten up my image, but I make sure that I don't do it too much because I don't want that sky getting blown out everywhere. I think I also bring down the highlights a little bit here and there, but again, you have to limit yourself, especially in my case for this image, because if I bring the highlights down too much, you're gonna start to notice that sky looks bad. I bring the shadows up by about 40 or 50 to bring out more detail on those rocks. It was an underexposed image and I still blew out the sky. That's how big that dynamic range was in the image. I also removed some clarity in the whole image because I just like that ethereal look, especially on a seascape. It kind of just, not only does it help the graduation in the sky from the tones that are happening in the brightest parts to the darkest part, it's also going to just help with the mistiness or the ethereal look of those waves that are crashing into the rocks. A few other things I do are I bring up the dehaze for the whole image. This is just going to add a little bit of punch and contrast into a lot of the areas of the image. I kind of just like the way it looks for this particular image. And then I think I also add medium contrast on my tone curve. This is pretty standard for me depending on the image. And then the last things I do are balance my saturation and white balance. I always wait to balance saturation at the end of the image. I think the first thing I do is remove about 20 or 25 blue saturation from my HSL slider, and then I remove some saturation from the whole image. So there's a wave coming. I'm going to hold on to my camera. So what I do is, because when you're adding saturation or clarity or dehaze or almost every manipulation in a photo, it's going to add saturation to your image naturally. So I always wait to do the overall saturation of my image, and I remove about 10 or 15 from this image, and I just kind of balance that around how saturated I want the image to look. And that's usually the last setting that I change. I think the final thing I typically do right before exporting is add some sharpening. In this particular case, I think I did 70 sharpening and masked about 5 to remove some of the sharpening in some of the clouds or that blown out area. And that's pretty much it. That's that whole edit. I have one more example to show you that I'm going to move my camera really quick so that I could talk about it, because the tide is definitely coming in and I don't really want to lose this camera to the tide. Man, it is absolutely gorgeous though. Let me show you where we're at. Absolutely spectacular. Apologies for that interruption. As I said, we're out here trying to make this work. So the next image isn't necessarily about being overexposed or underexposed or lacking data. It was actually just that I took the image, and I remember in the field just having more light on this flower of this image that I took. Now I did underexpose it, but there's plenty of data there to work with and that I can manipulate in post. So for this, we're actually just going to create a light source in our image. We're not necessarily fixing any particular technical errors, as in it's not, again, overexposed or underexposed, and we're not building around a troublesome part of the image. What we're doing is just taking what I thought was going to work when I took the image and fixing it in post using some techniques. So again, the whole concept here is building your edit around one particular thing that the image needs. In the last image, it was that sky is overexposed. let's build around that. And this particular image is that the light is not on the flower like I expected it to be, so let's try to make the light there, kind of, sort of. So let me show you really quick. All we're really going to be doing is using a radial filter to create a source of light in our image. I did a full breakdown on it here if you want to check that out, and it goes into full detail of how you can do it, but realistically you can just follow along here and understand. Normally my suggestion is to decrease the exposure of your image by about 1 stop and then add it back in using a radial filter, but in this particular case the image is already pretty underexposed to begin with, so I'm just going to leave that there. So all I'm going to do is create a radial filter by pressing Shift-M on my keyboard, and I'm going to make it really big. It's like a giant source of light. And I'm going to zoom out of my image. You can do this on the navigating tab on Lightroom, or just press Z and scroll out. And then basically I want that entire thing to just look like a spotlight on my image. It's really big, huge feather, and then all I'm going to do is increase my exposure, I think in this image, by almost an entire stop of 1. And then the other thing you really want to manipulate is your whites. Those are the 2 things you really want to use when you're using this particular tool. And then maybe bring your dehaze down a little bit, because what that'll do is create kind of like an atmosphere effect that the light is now creating in your image. And the one thing you're going to notice is that it's now brightening the top half of the image a bit too much rather than just the flower. And to fix this, we're just going to use the same method we did just like in the last radial filter. We're going to subtract a graduated filter from a radial filter and just have a natural fall off as it goes to the top of the image. I guess it would be this way. So to do that, we're just going to hit subtract, make a radial filter, graduated filter, and drag it from our flower up, and then that's going to remove part of the mask there and affect that area a little bit less. And that's it. We just created kind of a source of light on our flower, and you can tell if I turn this entire mask on and off what it actually is doing to the image, and it really makes it pop. It really makes it look like how I thought it was going to look in person, even though the conditions didn't really turn out to be the way that I wanted them to. That's pretty much all I have for you today. Like I said, this video isn't necessarily about a new tool or an editing technique to level up your images. It's more of a concept. It's how to approach some of your images, whether they have limitations or not. I actually think it's really important to sit down with an image and ask yourself, what does this image need? In this particular case, it was that an image needed, well, us to edit around that overexposed part of the image. Now, what I could have done is taken a second exposure that I didn't necessarily need a bracketed image for and just blended the sky in of a darker exposure. Considering that horizon line is so straight, it would have been easy. But I just didn't do it. I was so just enamored by the wind and just overwhelmed with things going on that I just snapped that one photo or a few photos and just tried to manipulate my composition more than worrying about getting a perfect exposure. And I think that that's really important that all of you guys understand, is that sometimes you're not going to have the time. Sometimes you're so focused on other things that you don't have time to set up a tripod or think about perfect exposure or bracketing your image or focus stacking. You're really just trying to capture that light as it's happening, and that's all you're going to get. So for those images like that one, I think it's important to know it doesn't have to be perfect. And it's really interesting, and that's why I wanted to make this whole video, that to build around that imperfection, I think we actually came away with an image that works. One more example I have is I took this a few days ago and I bracketed this image. I have the data there for those shadows, but I kind of like the dark feel of the image, so I edited my entire image around that darker feel. The whole image is definitely underexposed, and I left those parts in shadow because I like the way the silhouette looked in the sea stacks on that sea. So I hope that this was educational, or at least got your brain thinking about the fact that not all of our images have to be perfect, and that sometimes we're going to walk away with some that we like, but maybe we'd say, no, I'm not going to edit this because I don't have the perfect data or the perfect image to start with. So hope this was helpful. If you liked it, you can like it. And if you loved it and you love this crazy journey that I'm on, consider subscribing, and I'll see you again next week. Later.